This is the One Point Podcast, and I'm Rohit Yadav. Winning the manufacturing game is becoming a key topic for the US right now. What China has done well over the past 50 years, the US now has a similar opportunity. And given a strong push towards securing supply chain, critical industries, and reigniting domestic buildup, the topic of hard tech startups has gained phenomenal traction. But there are also structural headwinds, and we cannot take them lightly. So today I have with me an exceptional investor and a thought leader, Aidan Madigan-Curtis, to walk us through this trend from inside out. Welcome, Aidan, to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Aidan is partner at Eclipse Capital. Before Eclipse, she was an executive at Samsara and the manufacturing for Apple Watch, and also investor at Bridgewater. She has an extensive knowledge on the manufacturing and the supply chains and what will it take to bring the manufacturing back to home, which is US. She also sits on 10 corporate boards spanning defense and industrial sectors and a broad area of technologies. I'm sure we all would really enjoy a conversation today with everything going on in the world right now. So Aidan, thank you again for joining in. First and foremost, what is Eclipse?
Sure. I think it's a great point. There's never a dull moment these days, so happy to chat. Eclipse, we are a physical technology investment firm. We invest early stage and growth stage venture capital. And essentially, the industries that we invest in are technology disruptors across manufacturing, transportation, energy, supply chain, logistics, defense. If it's part of those tough stuff, backbone of the economy, dirt under your fingernail style industry, that's where we love to play. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, so what differentiates Eclipse from the other VC funds which are actually within the same scope and size?
So Eclipse actually has been at this for the last decade. There are many investors in the last few years based on the disruptions we saw in COVID, some of the recent geopolitical challenges, climate change based disruption that have realized we don't make things here in the US anymore. We have a struggle with our ability to power our economy that, peace may not be necessarily something that we can rely on throughout the world. And there's been a real scramble, I think, as well as a bit of a land grab and an opportunity grab where early stage investors and growth stage investors have realized there's a lot of wood to chop here in North America. And there are companies that need to be built in order for us to sustain our way of being and our economy. Eclipse has been doing this for a long time. We saw this opportunity well before most other people came to realize it. We've been investing for the last decade across these sectors and in everything from software-only companies that are shifting the way that the cost curves work in these spaces to fully vertically integrated manufacturing approaches or transportation and logistics solutions. There are a few other things that really differentiate us. So number one, we are all a team of partners who are former operators in these industries. Myself, I was an executive at Samsara. I joined that company pre-product, pre-revenue to lead all of our operations, everything from global supply chain and silicon work all the way through customer delivery and customer support. My partners are the people who were at the helm of all manufacturing for Tesla, or who led all of the commercial operations at Rivian, who've been key leaders at Flextronics, Flexport, GE, SunPower. If it's one of these emblematic, iconic names in these physical industries and a tech leader in the space, Eclipse probably has a partner who's really seen the whole story and understands the success criteria and what it takes to build something great like that. So I guess that's my last key point in our differentiation. We love hard things. Nothing really scares us. We've been there, done that. And if you look at companies like Tesla, like SpaceX, like NVIDIA or Apple or Nextera, these are the trillion-dollar companies. It takes not being afraid of both atoms plus bits and the power that they have when you bring them together in creative and innovative ways to truly shift the way an industry functions. Those are the types of companies that we're looking for and that we invest in. And we love to do it as early as seed stage investing or even starting a company with a founder, all the way through growth stage crossover investing. And we have about $5 billion under management.
And tell us some of the key highlights from your portfolio recently.
Great. Well, you may have heard, as I mentioned, over the past 10 years, we've been investing in these spaces. So we have some early portfolio winners like Cerebras, which is Andrew Feldman's wafer scale AI company. That company is very significant, very scaled, and really probably the key competitor to NVIDIA in terms of AI compute capabilities, both for training and for inference. Another one of our early bets that's really winning in their space is a company called Wave. Wave is based out of the UK, is a reinforcement learning and computer vision based autonomy platform for first driverless cars. You can think of it as probably these days the key competitor to Waymo, with partnerships across large automotive OEMs and scaling rapidly both in the UK as well as in the US. We have many others in our early stage portfolio, names that you've probably heard about raising significant rounds, doing really intriguing things. Companies like True Anomaly, which is a space based defense company, Vulcan Forms, which is a 3D metal additive company that's really one of the key domestic winners in metal fabrication here in the US. A company like Bedrock Robotics, which just came out of stealth, but raised a $300 million plus valuation round to do autonomous excavation. That's a team out of Waymo that is taking the first lessons of the several million miles originally driven driverlessly at Waymo and taking it to adjacent industries for very verticalized approaches to physical AI. I can name many others. Peak Energy, which is battery electric storage and winning in their space. Mitra Systems, which is robotic systems for fulfillment. Blue Water Autonomy, which also just came out of their stealth, having raised a $50 million round from GV after we seed founded the company last year. So many different companies that people have probably heard of along the way, all companies we're really proud to be investors in, and many of them since day one.
Okay, awesome. Thanks for painting a picture about Eclipse and the portfolios. So I hear you. The biggest differentiator is you are all operators, and that's where the edge comes from. I want to move to the core of this discussion. You wrote an article about what would it take to bring back US manufacturing, in which you talk about America's structural headwinds. So US has been optimized towards, high value services for decades now. How do you think about the risk of tariffs backfiring, that is, raising costs for the very equipment you need to industrialize or reindustrialize rather? So in your sense, are the tariffs ultimately a bridge or a trap?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I'm not going to answer directly bridge or trap because tariffs are a useful tool, but it's really important to understand how they work. So let's just do a quick economics 101 here first. Tariffs essentially raise the price of an imported good so that a domestic good can compete, right? So by definition, in essence, what a tariff is doing is raising prices for goods for domestic buyers, allowing for those domestic industries to hopefully catch up and look and feel more competitive. But if people want to keep buying the goods they're buying today, the prices on those goods are going to increase. Now, sometimes the tariff can be successfully passed along and paid for by the company that produces it. But oftentimes, especially over time, these increases in costs get passed along to consumers. If you ask me what the goal should be, it should be for us to take multiple approaches to strengthening our domestic manufacturing and industrial capabilities, while also ensuring that those capabilities we're building are the most competitive in the world. So certainly we don't have the capacity to manufacture nearly as much today as we want to, right? As we consume, we're importing trillions and trillions of dollars worth of goods every year, many of them across critical industries such as networking gear, consumer electronics, many key components and integrated circuits that go into critical functions like our defense capabilities, even critical parts of agriculture, pharmaceutical inputs, things like that, right? So I do think it's important that the United States, for its national priority and for its strategic priorities, can have a baseline capability to sustain and sort of fend for itself. But what we really need to be focused on is how do we become competitive in these industries? What we don't want to do is create a crutch that domestic industry can lean on where it's not competitive and can't actually produce, more for less. We want to be able to really inspire innovation as in these types of industries so that our companies here that are in these sectors can really flourish and flourish even as a global competitor to some of the very impressive competition, for example, in things like battery equipment or networking or consumer electronics that we see overseas, particularly in Asia. Let me explain really quickly what an example of this might look like. You've probably heard of the Gilded Age. That was, roughly 100+ years ago in the United States when we had the railroad barons and things like that. There was a process that was developed in the late 1800s. It's called the Bessemer process. The Bessemer process was essentially a order of magnitude cheaper approach to producing steel. Bessemer's process, actually, this was Andrew Carnegie who brought this to the US. It was leveraging some key innovations actually from scientists across the world, including in the UK. But Carnegie was really the one who leaned into industrializing this solution. And as a function of that, he was able to truly dominate US steel production and lay down all the tracks for the railroads, so on and so forth, vertically integrate. It really made him the Carnegie that we all know today. We need these types of innovations that allow us to produce major industrial output for 10x cheaper here. And it's really through technology that we're going to create that productivity.
Okay. So with respect to tariffs, you are not saying whether it's a bridge or a trap. Laid out that it might increase the domestic prices to some extent, but in some industries, it's also effective to kind of cover the internal innovations and so on. Right now, if you think about the blanket tariffs, and there is just one 10% blanket tariff, right? There is no, and there's some kind of areas which are free from tariff. So it's not really impacting the US in the terms of cost as much as a lot of people might be thinking.
I think we've experienced a lot of volatility, and many companies and consumers are not entirely sure yet what to price in. It's actually really interesting. One of the issues is with the volatility. Volatility causes economic disturbances. So if I were to ask you, how would you behave if you thought the price of all goods was going to go up tomorrow? What would you do today? You'd go out and buy
Maybe,
stuff,
yeah,
right? So that you didn't
buy
have to
more
pay
of
more
it.
for it. You didn't have to pay more for it tomorrow. So we did see some of these types of effects earlier in the spring, a lot of stockpiling of inventory, just given a lot of economic uncertainty. I think right now, and by the way, the flip side is true. If you thought prices were going to be cheaper next week or next month, you'd wait to get, you'd probably wait as long as you could, right, to get your good at a cheaper rate. So the notion of a lack of certainty around sort of predictable pricing trends, economic independence of interest rate setting, things like that, are certainly causing some distortions, economically speaking. And I think we've yet to see truly where all the impacts of pending tariffs, potential tariffs, coming tariffs, next rounds of trade negotiations, for example, like for USMCA across North America, will land. And some of this volatility, I think, is both masking effects that people are experiencing today, masking the effects on companies who, many of whom actually are stating that they are paying billions in tariffs and it is impacting their earnings, and what ultimately may get passed through to the consumer.
Got it. So I want to talk about the capital in the industrial base now. So you have a figure that you estimate that over $1 trillion of annual investment would be required to double the US manufacturing capacity. So tell us why this number is important, like $1 trillion to double the manufacturing capacity. And strategically, should the US prioritize the broad-based reindustrialization, or the focus should be on very few critical sectors like semiconductors, defense, and so on?
Yeah. Um, so the $1 trillion figure really came from assessing the amount that we import relative to what it would take over time for us to manufacture not only the end goods, but also critical inputs to the supply chains, like critical integrated circuits, memory, key pharmaceutical ingredients. There's a lot of first, second, and third order supply chain that we source from all over the world. I once did an analysis of this, but I think something to the effect of one of the Apple products I was involved in, I won't say which, went to the moon and back by destination something like 11 times in terms of how many times it went around the world with all of its critical components to produce an end device. So it's a very global supply chain that we're coming from. Do I think that we should be really focused? I absolutely do. I don't think it necessarily makes sense for the country to become completely mercantilist, right? Let's be protectionist. Let's shut all our doors. Economics has proven time and again in every textbook in every country that there is something to the concept of comparative advantage. So we all do better across, globally speaking, when we cooperate and when we work together, and also when we compete with each other successfully to, win the consumers' dollar over with the fewest barriers possible in terms of having the greatest product at the cheapest rate winning, right? So there's something to this notion of comparative advantage and what economics has taught us over the years. That said, there are critical um, there are critical sectors and critical products that we need to be able to make here. For example, there's been a lot of discussion about rare earth magnets and rare earth minerals. These minerals are actually pretty available in the US, but the processing step to extract them and refine them is very capital intensive. It's not the most environmentally healthy or friendly thing to do. And over 90% of the world's capacity for this process exists in China. So, do we need to do more of that here in the US if we want to secure our supply chains, especially since these magnets go into electric vehicles, they go into robotic actuators, they go into a lot of our defense applications and hardware. These are really key components to how we've built a lot of technologies that run our lives these days. So yes, we need to be independent on that. We can't be necessarily reliant solely on anybody else for that, but it's going to take many years for us to build up the capacity to do so. So the short term probably looks like more strategic deal making across the world. And in the long term, we've seen a number of companies spring up over the past couple of years that are trying to address how do we extract and process these critical minerals here in the United States, but do it in a way that's 10 times cheaper, that's environmentally friendly, that's leveraging a really modern approach so that we're not just copying and pasting the same approaches as is working elsewhere. There are many other industries I could point to. Networking gear, right? The US doesn't build really its own routers and switches and cables, and that may sound like the world's most boring stuff, but actually we power and communicate on every topic across corporations and consumers. Our whole lives are built on this technology. And we do need to be able to secure our own supply of these things. The same thing is true for pharmaceutical ingredients and many other things that we've, over the past 30 years, really shifted to other countries, predominantly in Asia. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention semiconductors. I laugh because I'm not sure if you read this article. I wrote one about how the US is essentially building very, very expensive paperweights if all we do is fabricate semiconductors here, because then we ship them straight back to Asia to get popped and stacked and diced and tested. There's this whole process that happens after you fabricate a semiconductor to turn it into a real integrated circuit and then to include it in a full electronic device, most of which we don't do here and is also somewhat capitally intensive. So there's a lot more that we need to build here. These manufacturing plants across industries can cost, hundreds of millions of dollars. So it doesn't take that much to add up to that $1 trillion. And it's also a process that will take many years. A factory can take as short as 18 months to build. It's not only, there's this great story of the Intel fab in Arizona being delayed, not by the lack of, for example, semiconductor technicians available in Arizona, but by the lack of plumbers and electricians and even construction workers to build a building, just the building on their timeline. A lot of data centers are getting held up by the lack of availability of grid capability and new substations that are going to need to get built and new generation assets that need to get brought online in order for us to go achieve our AI dreams here in this country. We face a lot of structural headwinds at the same time. It's a really exciting moment to be playing in building innovative solutions in those spaces.
Okay. So as I hear you, the focusing on few critical areas or sectors is the way to go for the US. I have two follow-up questions on this. One is, where would this $1 trillion come from?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we're spending trillions of dollars now on imports, right? Well, I do believe a lot of the commitments being made by companies to spend hundreds of billions of dollars of manufacturing here in the US are a bit of an overstatement. I think that there's a real push for Fortune 500 companies to bring more of their operations onshore to the US to create jobs as a function of that, to be doing exactly that investing in order to build up their operations here and avoid a tariff, and to sort of leverage, therefore, domestic production. Just because you're an international company, like Nestle, for example, it doesn't mean you can't actually manufacture your goods here in the US. So part of the incentive structure here is to get the world's largest companies bringing more capacity, manufacturing, production, and otherwise, and then the jobs that come with it here to the US. Now, to my earlier point about volatility, if you're a CEO of a large company trying to decide whether or not to pull the trigger on a multi-dozen billion or $100 billion set of investments, you better be sure that 4 years later, the same rules are going to be in place or that the same incentive structures are going to be there for you. Like, as I mentioned, it takes a while to actually bring up this capacity. So these are long-term decisions. And that also might be one of the reasons why we're not necessarily seeing every company rush to break ground with their shovels and their picks. There's some thoughtfulness that goes around it, but I do think that some of it will come from domestic companies, some of it will come from international companies. There are some tax subsidies that are getting piled into sectors like energy when it comes to, for example, nuclear, big push for nuclear. And so there's sort of like capital across the board. I think that's ready to go. For example, if there's more domestic investment happening in some of these technologies that we've been talking about, as long as our early stage and growth stage companies that are trying something new, a new way of modular manufacturing, a new form of battery energy, if those companies can demonstrate that they have what you call a bankable offtake, so you've got a key customer, whether it's a large consumer electronics company that wants to buy enclosures from you in your new manufacturing process, whether it's a large medical device company that's committed to work with you, to the tune of some very big numbers, let's call it 8 figures, right, to buy the goods produced from your factory. That's called a bankable offtake, and you can literally take that to infrastructure investors and other capital that's ready to write bigger checks, but at lower risk. And through a combination of both equity and debt and infrastructure financing, get those larger factories built out.
Got it. I loved what you said. There should be something which is bankable, and also kind of there should be something robust around that thing, and not every business is jumping to it. I remember in Europe there was long time back push towards solar production and solar energy, and so all the nations were kind of pushing for it, and then one or two nations kind of retroactively put a tax on it, and it immediately become a no game for all the investors. So they need a stabilization. My second question is around, do you know if there is a ranking mechanism? I know it's a very random question in this. So how would you rank these lot of critical sectors? You talked about semiconductor, you talked about defense, energy, and so on. Is there a ranking mechanism which the US is using right now, or is there a list?
Yeah, I don't believe there's a force rank anywhere. I could be wrong. Who knows what they have over there in Washington on their desks? I don't even pretend to know. But I think the reality is they all matter. Can't build a electric vehicle without the battery and the powertrain and the electronics inside of it, right? And the rare earth magnets that we talked about that form the actuators. You can't put people in these factories if you don't have the key pharmaceutical ingredients that allow for medicines that are basic to human survival, right? Which are also typically made overseas these days. To have a thriving economy, to have a functional economy, and to have a protected economy, we need to be able to be somewhat independent on all of those fronts. So in that respect, I don't think, a force rank wouldn't do very good, because you could have the most brilliant, innovative battery in the world, but if you don't have the vehicle to put it in, you don't have a car, right? So, you really need all of these things to work in concert together to build a successful economy.
And when you talked about structural headwinds in your article, you also mentioned labor and workforce. So in that, you mentioned US is short on around 5 million skilled workers, right? And you mentioned a couple of examples as well from Arizona and so on. So should the idea be to train the talent or import talent in some cases, or maybe to kind of redefine manufacturing through automation? And which is the best lever for the next 5 to 10 years?
The answer is yes. So all of the
Yes,
above,
yes to
right?
all.
Yes to all. We need to do all of it. We have such a significant gap, right, in terms of our capacity relative to what we want to be able to go do. I'll get to the tech piece in the end. Obviously, it's one of the most exciting. But first, let me start with imported talent. I personally believe that it's been core to American exceptionalism that throughout the past few centuries, this country has built itself on the promise of the American dream. People have come here to attend the world's best universities. They've come here to be part of the world's most thriving economy. They've come here to participate in some of the companies that are really creating breakthrough innovations. And actually, something to the tune of, of the 500 unicorns sampled by Stanford or something over the past decade, like 44% of the founders were born outside of the US, right? So also a lot of our innovation engine is created by, not entirely by, but by, in no small part, people who maybe are now American citizens, maybe they became naturalized over time or they're green card holders, but they started as F1 visa holders, or they started, by being skilled in such a way, coming to the US to perform a certain job and then being able to graduate into starting their own company, or being Satya Nadella, who was born in India and is now CEO at Microsoft, being Sundar, who was also born in India, now CEO at Google, right? Jensen Huang from NVIDIA, from Taiwan, and so on and so forth. So I really think it's an incredible blend of skilled talent that we get both born and trained inside the country and from external to the country, and that we really need as a country to keep that permeability there and to continue to attract the world's best and the brightest to our institutions here. I think that's really important. And so a big raving yes to that answer. Let's talk about semi-skilled labor, which actually probably isn't very fair because a lot of the labor I'm about to talk about does require real skill. It's construction work, it's manufacturing, some of the manufacturing and warehousing work, it's agricultural work, something to the tune of like potentially 10 to 20% of the US meatpacking workforce has been quoted as maybe not necessarily even being documented, right? And being immigrant and currently being faced with the tough choice about whether or not to come to work. So I think that it's also, I'm not saying that people who have crossed the border illegally shouldn't face consequences for those actions. But I think one thing we do need to realize is that there is a lot of labor in the country that has come from abroad and is doing a lot of really tough and semi-skilled work, and a thoughtful approach to how we want to navigate that, because they're doing a lot of work in critical sectors that we just talked about: agriculture, construction, some manufacturing work, meat packing work, things like that are really a critical component of our economy. We face like a 3.7 to 4 million housing unit shortage in the country, right? We are short millions of construction workers already. So a lot of these jobs are tough, they're very dangerous. And I think that there's a number of programs that can be put in place or adjusted to help us navigate some of the challenges of those less or semi-skilled labor openings.
Got it.
The last thing I'll say, because you did ask about automation.
Yes.
Yes. So automation is the other side of the coin, right? How many conversations have I been in with incredible people who work in some of these very demanding physical jobs? I spend many days on site in everything from ports to agricultural facilities, farms, construction sites. I think many of these people would love if they could do their work, not from the hot cab of an excavator, but instead from the air-conditioned comfort of the trailer on site, or even from home. The ability to have technology actually do the work itself, or at least be far greater, you'd be far more automated in the work that it does, so that we're taking the humans out of the situations that are dangerous, environmentally unsound, hazardous to their health. Construction is the most fatal job in the country, right? Followed quickly by transportation, right? And these are areas where we are trying to push autonomy alongside manufacturing. The number one reason why manufacturing labor turns over so much is someone shows up first day on the job and doesn't realize how loud it is. Many of these manufacturing sites are just loud. And I know that sounds maybe not that bad for someone who's not understanding the din that I'm talking about day in and day out, that often many manufacturing workers have to deal with, right? So these are environments that, to the extent that we can provide people assistance with technology, or even allow people to take a step back from the front line and instead be the technician or be the operator of something that is, not directly doing the dangerous work, that's a key area of focus for our portfolio. And I think very much an everybody wins scenario.
I didn't now want to jump on the second article of yours, which is focused on making American manufacturing more productive. And one of the point is venture capital is traditionally focused on asset light plays, but hard tech is more capex heavy, right? So there are strategic challenges. How do you think this hard tech revival will come in this age and space? Do you think there's new VC model that needs to be there? Or do you think there needs to be government-led investments and so on?
Yeah. So what I'll say is, It's understandable the approach that many VCs have taken over the last few decades. Software was eating the world, super high growth, very high margin, quick to scale. Venture capital, if you think about it as not just an asset class, but as a slice of an LP's portfolio, is meant to be both high risk, but also extremely high return, right? So, venture capital is meant to be taking big swings, to be having several massive returners out of a portfolio of maybe 10 to 20 bets, and to be able to return a lot of capital back to the LPs as a function of those high risk, high reward types of investments. If you think about that, you really want something that can go from a $5 million check to a $5 billion return from your portfolio, right? And if you're owning percent of the company at the moment of liquidity, that needs to be a $50 billion company, right? For you to take $5 billion and give it back to your LPs. So really what you're looking for is a few companies, one or two per portfolio. Obviously, every bet you take at the outset, you want to be a winner. Over time, the power law states that, and this is what we've seen it again and again, if you're good, even if you're good, really just one or two, maybe three, will be a big winner. So when you have that mindset, you're not trying to make things harder for yourself. It's already hard enough to make a $5 million check turn into a $5 billion outcome. So really you're looking for something that has a massive market, a killer team, and huge opportunity to scale and then be rewarded by the public markets very richly. What I think we've seen happen over the past few years that Eclipse, I think, always believed in, and public markets and venture investors are catching up to now, is when you build in physical industries, especially when you take a truly innovative hybrid approach that leverages condensing your supply chain, manufacturing differently, bringing technology to bear in critical ways that shift the cost curve, you can just dominate and run away with an industry, and you can trade like a technology company, even one that has hardware involved, rather than a traditional low margin, low profit industrial player. So good examples of this that I mentioned earlier are a company like Tesla, which absolutely trades like a technology company because sure, is it a car company? Is it a battery and grid company? Is it a humanoid robotics company, right? Is it a general physical AI company? Well, the answer is yes, right? And so it's really interesting when you think about some of these investments. You could look at SpaceX the same way. I mean, SpaceX, very, very tough to get off the ground, very sort of unfavorable in its early days to try and compete against rocket launching was a entirely sort of government backed sector. But they believed there was need and there would be need for a commercial company that was doing rocket launching. Um, Elon Musk scrapped together the capital to do it and believed in it. And is that company a rocket launching company? Is it a airline to Mars? Is it a internet communications company with Starlink, right? So it's really, really incredible when companies sort of put a stake in the ground in these large physical industries, take a really innovative approach that allows them to bend the cost curve, which every Musk company does. So I think people have really come around to the fact that you can build not only incredibly scalable companies that actually perform at a reasonably high gross margin, you can get the growth of those companies capitalized intelligently by a mix of debt and equity and other forms of capital. And you can actually just dominate an industry with a massive moat and deep technical differentiation if you think about it the right way and invest cleverly.
Got it. I mean, with productivity always comes the question of the SMEs within the US, right? And you quote that 98% of the US manufacturers are SMEs and maybe 74% are less than 30 employees, I think. And what's the barrier? What's the bottleneck for them to adopting new technologies, advanced technologies, automation, and so on? Do you think it's technical? Do you think it's financial or maybe cultural?
For most small and medium enterprises, I would say it, it comes down to two things. One is access to capital. These are sort of traditionally lower gross margin industries. So if you're a traditional player and you're trying to make deep investments in autonomy or in other automation within your manufacturing plant or your warehouse, who is the leader in automating warehouse technology or warehouses? It wasn't the mom and pop shop warehousers, it was Amazon, right? Like it was the company that had the ROI and the balance sheet to take a big swing, realizing it would revolutionize their competitiveness, and it did. And then sort of setting the pace. So if you're a warehouse and you want to compete, you absolutely have to take steps in that direction. I think we'll see something similar happen on the manufacturing front, but going back to the 98% of manufacturing that is small and medium enterprise, I think that those companies will over time either be rolled up or acquired, will be able to get financing for some innovation they want to uh, put into their sites based on proven technologies. Also, there will be new global players that become highly competitive here in the US, whether they're US based or otherwise, that are technology first.
Okay. I think you mentioned one of the key highlights, that is roll-ups, which are happening quite a lot, and a lot of VCs now raising funds for roll-ups, AI roll-ups. I want to move for the last 10 minutes to another critical section because you're part of Eclipse. Obviously, there are a lot of answers that the startups and the founders might need. So from your side, from your experience being part of Apple Watch manufacturing or later or leading ops with Samsara, what are those lessons and experiences that help you evaluate founders and technologies today?
Yeah, I'll start with Samsara because I think some of my lessons from Apple are a bit different. Working at Samsara for more than half a decade taught me, number one, that founder quality and founder experience means a lot. You're looking for, and I think this is true across every investment Eclipse makes today, we're looking for absolutely world-class founders. What that means can actually manifest itself in a lot of different ways. There's more experienced second or third time founders who've cut their teeth on the tough stuff of what it means to build something. And have scar tissue, but also wisdom. There's also, younger founders who just show up with all the passion in the world, whose learning curve and aggression about what they want to go do makes up for the lack of experience and have an open mindedness to what they might not know so that they can learn incredibly effectively, really understand their customer needs. Um, and build truly technically differentiated solutions at a super rapid pace. I would say some common traits. So just to say, they kind of come in different shapes and sizes. Some traits that they all share in terms of world-class founders would be extremely high integrity, extremely confident yet open-minded. You need to be able to actually have a back and forth with this person to be able to challenge them in a way that they actually hear you. But you should assume that they've got to be pretty confident in themselves, in their team, and in what they're doing in order to break through just the world of haterade that is trying to start something. They tend to be data driven. They have instincts and they have a gut notion of what they need to go do, but they pressure test those instincts with data they get, whether it's through customer conversations and market analysis, or whether it's through, other data that can be derived from their operation. They're constantly trying to make sure that if they're thinking something, there's evidence that that thought pattern is correct. And this is actually a really critical thing because even the most qualified founder at a different stage, like each stage is different from the next. And so it's also why you see very few truly founder-led companies that are public and the founders at the helm for a long time. You have to reskin yourself so many different times. The person in a garage coding on their computer or tinkering with a robot or putting together a manufacturing line looks totally different than a public market CEO who's up there on an earnings call or ringing the bell at the NASDAQ, navigating the HR challenges and the executive challenges and the PR challenges and the culture challenges of what it means to be a public market company, right? So it's really hard. You need to find someone truly, truly adaptable. So anyway, first I would say it's really about founders. Next, I would say equally, these people need to be laser focused on a specific problem that they're going to go solve. So often companies come with a technology first solution, like, hey, I made this really cool thing and I think it could apply to lots of use cases. That's almost the initial death of the company. What you want to do is make sure that you have zoned in on a customer problem, could also be consumer problem, but you really have a clear sense of a gap that there is to fill and someone who's going to pay you to fill that gap with a truly differentiated solution. It needs to be differentiated to get the switch in place, no matter what you're doing. If you're B2B or even B2C, you need to compel people to your product. So it's got to be not just as good as the next thing or as good as what they use today, but like 10 times better. So have your eye on exactly what the problem is you want to go solve, know why you're the right person and the right team to go solve it, and then have a truly differentiated solution that is clearly something that's going to be a world of change for your customer. And make sure that you've pressure tested with your customer how much they're willing to pay for it.
What should founders and their business ideas, if they have, and their pitch decks, what do these all things need to have to win allocation from Eclipse Capital?
I think I mentioned it earlier already, but we love to see every founder and founding team passionate about solving real problems in the real world with a next differentiated solution and an extreme urgency to go build that thing and to build it with the best people on the planet for that solution. That is a company that we would love to meet. We'd love to meet them when they're getting started. We're also happy to meet them along the way. Many companies in our space face horrific J curves. And by that, I mean all the excitement of what it's like to dream a dream and to get the dream team in place. Then the reality hits of how hard it is to build that thing. We have many companies that go through that challenge when the rubber meets the road, when you're actually dealing with atoms in the real world, when you're actually trying to extract a purchase order from your customer who promised that they would do it. Reality hurts sometimes, and we're there for it. And we tend to be really important backers for physical world companies when stuff gets tough. We are the tough stuff investors. So anyway, that's what I would say. We'd love to see those types of founders, regardless of where they are in their journey.
So, Adam, thank you so much. With those nice words, let's close this session of podcast here. Thank you so much for covering, I would say, like a broad area on manufacturing and how it can be brought back. What are the challenges? What the startups need to do, what the founders need to think, and how they need to kind of win allocation from you, Eclipse, right? So, thank you so much for joining in today.
Thanks for having me.